It was a Tuesday morning, January 15th, 1947. The sun was already climbing over the Limerick Park neighborhood of Los Angeles, California. The streets were quiet, peaceful, ordinary. A young mother named Betty Bersinger was walking through the neighborhood with her 3-year-old daughter. She was heading out for a routine morning errand, pushing her child along the sidewalk on South Norton Avenue. It was a residential street, lined with empty lots and modest homes. Nothing unusual, nothing alarming, until Betty saw something in the grass. Before I tell you this story, I want you to stop for a second. Look around you. Notice where you are right now, because what you are about to hear happened in broad daylight, in one of the most famous cities in the world, in front of everyone, and nobody saw anything. So tell me, where are you watching this from? Drop your city in the comments right now. I want to see how far this story travels, and what time is it where you are. Because I promise you, after you hear what happened on the morning of January 15th, 1947, you will never forget this date. This is the story of Elizabeth Short, the woman the world would come to know as the Black Dahlia. And this is the most shocking unsolved murder Hollywood has ever seen. Welcome to Kill and Trace. This is the channel where no crime goes unexplored and no killer goes untraced. Hit that subscribe button right now, because this case has 4 parts, and trust me, you do not want to miss what comes next. And if you have heard about the Black Dahlia before, drop a comment below and tell me how much you already know. Let's see who has been doing their research. Alright, now let's go back to January 1947, Los Angeles, California, and a crime scene that made hardened police detectives physically sick. At first, she thought it was a store mannequin, a broken, discarded department store dummy that someone had dumped on the side of the road. It was lying in an empty lot, placed near the sidewalk. The figure was pale, almost impossibly white, completely motionless. Betty slowed down. She looked closer, and then she realized this was not a mannequin. It was a human body, a young woman, completely naked, and she had been cut completely in half at the waist. Betty Bersinger grabbed her daughter and ran to the nearest house. She hammered on the door and begged the resident to call the police immediately. Her hands were shaking. Her voice was barely holding together. She had just seen something that no human being should ever have to see. Within minutes, the first patrol officers arrived at the scene. Officers Frank Perkins and Will Fitzgerald pulled up to the empty lot on South Norton Avenue and stepped out of their vehicle. They had been called to crime scenes before. They had seen violence before. But nothing in their entire careers had prepared them for what they were looking at. The body of a young woman was lying in the grass. She was positioned on her back, carefully placed near the sidewalk, with a deliberateness that immediately told investigators this was not a random act. The body had been posed. Her arms were raised above her head at right angles. Her legs were spread apart. She had been arranged almost theatrically, as if someone wanted her to be found exactly this way. But the most horrifying detail was what had been done to the body itself. She had been severed completely in half at the waist, cleanly, precisely. The 2 halves of her body had been drained completely of blood, meaning she had not been killed here. She had been killed somewhere else. Her body completely drained of every drop of blood, and then transported to this location and placed here deliberately. Her skin was so pale it appeared almost translucent in the morning light. Officers initially reported that she looked like a white porcelain doll from a distance. There was not a single drop of blood on the grass around her. Not one. Whoever had done this had cleaned her body, scrubbed it, before placing it at this location. Her face had been savagely cut on both sides, from the corners of her mouth extending back toward her ears in what investigators would later describe as a Glasgow smile. Her body showed evidence of severe torture that had taken place over an extended period of time before her death. There were precise, deliberate cuts and markings across multiple parts of her body. Some wounds showed signs of having been made while she was still alive. Investigators who arrived at the scene within the hour were visibly shaken. Los Angeles Police Department detectives who had worked homicides for years stood at that empty lot and struggled to process what they were seeing. One officer reportedly had to step away from the scene entirely. A photographer from the Los Angeles Examiner newspaper, one of the first media personnel to arrive, later said he had nightmares about what he photographed that morning for the rest of his life. Word spread fast. By mid-morning, the empty lot on South Norton Avenue was surrounded by police tape, patrol vehicles, and growing crowds of neighbors and passers-by, trying to understand what had happened. News reporters were already arriving. The Los Angeles Police Department launched what would become one of the largest murder investigations in the history of the city. But first, They had to find out who she was. The body carried no identification, no clothing, no personal belongings of any kind. Nothing that could immediately tell investigators the name of this young woman whose life had been ended in the most brutal and calculated way imaginable. Fingerprint technicians were called to the scene. They carefully took fingerprints from the body and submitted them for analysis. In 1947, fingerprint identification was not the instantaneous process it is today. It took time. Investigators had to wait. Meanwhile, the medical examiner arrived and began his initial assessment of the body at the scene before it was transported. His preliminary findings were deeply disturbing. The body showed signs of having been kept for an extended period, possibly several days after death, before being deposited at this location. The precision of the bisection at the waist indicated someone with at least some medical or surgical knowledge, or someone who had taken extreme care to achieve a clean cut. The complete absence of blood indicated the body had been thoroughly washed and drained before transportation. The cause of death was determined to be blunt force trauma to the head, combined with lacerations to the face. She had been beaten severely, she had been tortured, and at some point during that ordeal she had died. She was estimated to be between 15 and 25 years old. She had dark black hair. She stood approximately 5 feet 5 inches tall. She had a small rose tattoo on her thigh, and she was completely, utterly unknown. For the first 24 hours, she had no name. She was simply referred to in police reports as Jane Doe No. 1, a young woman with no identity in a city that was already buzzing with the most shocking crime story it had encountered in years. The Los Angeles Examiner, one of the city's major newspapers at the time, used its own resources to help identify the body. The paper had access to FBI fingerprint files through a wire photo transmission system, one of the most advanced technologies available to newspapers in that era. They transmitted the victim's fingerprints to the FBI in Washington, D.C. The response came back quickly. The fingerprints matched a file in the FBI database. The young woman had been fingerprinted previously as part of a routine process when she had applied for a job. Her name was in the system. Her name was Elizabeth Short. She was 22 years old. She had been born on July 29, 1924, in Hyde Park, Massachusetts. She was the third of 5 daughters born to Cleo and Phoebe Short. Her father, Cleo Short, had disappeared when Elizabeth was just 6 years old, abandoning his family during the Great Depression. He had left his car near a bridge, leading everyone to believe he had committed suicide. Elizabeth and her sisters grew up in severe poverty with their mother struggling to support 5 children alone. Elizabeth Short had grown up with dreams. She was, by all accounts, a beautiful young woman, strikingly so, with fair skin, dark hair, and blue eyes. People who knew her described her as warm, friendly, and intensely focused on one dream. She wanted to be an actress. She wanted Hollywood. She wanted the lights and the glamour and the life that the movies promised. Like thousands of young women before her and after her, Elizabeth Short had come to Los Angeles, chasing that dream. She had arrived in the city sometime in 1946. She was 21 years old, alone, and surviving on very little money. She moved from place to place, staying with friends and acquaintances, rarely in one location for very long. She was known to frequent bars and restaurants in the downtown Los Angeles area, particularly in the district around South Figueroa Street. She was sociable. She talked to people easily. She made friends quickly. But she was also vulnerable. A young woman alone in a big city with no permanent address, no steady income, and no family nearby to watch out for her. Sometime in early January 1947, just days before her body was found on that empty lot, Elizabeth Short had vanished, and now the entire city of Los Angeles knew her name. But nobody, not the police, not the newspapers, not the thousands of people following this story, had any idea what had happened to her in those final days. That investigation was just beginning, and it would become the most complicated, most bizarre, and most haunting murder case in Hollywood history. When Elizabeth Short's name was released to the public on January 16, 1947, just one day after her body was discovered on that empty lot in Limit Park, the response from the city of Los Angeles was immediate and overwhelming. Newspapers ran her photograph on their front pages. Radio stations broadcast updates throughout the day. People across the city who had known Elizabeth Short, crossed paths with her, or simply recognized her face from the photograph, began calling the Los Angeles Police Department in massive numbers. Within the first 48 hours of the investigation, detectives were receiving hundreds of tips, leads, and pieces of information from the public, It was one of the largest outpourings of public response to a murder investigation that the LAPD had ever experienced, but quantity was not the same as quality. And buried inside those hundreds of phone calls and tips was a story of a young woman, as final weeks that was far more complicated and far more heartbreaking than anyone had initially imagined. To understand what happened to Elizabeth Short in January 1947, investigators had to go back further. They had to understand who she was, how she lived, and the world she moved through in the months before her death. Elizabeth had not always lived in Los Angeles. She had spent years moving between different cities on the East Coast and the West Coast, drifting in the way that many young Americans drifted during and after the Second World War. She had lived briefly in Miami, Florida, where she had been arrested in September 1943 at the age of 19 for underage drinking at a bar with a group of soldiers. That arrest was the reason her fingerprints were in the system. It was standard procedure for anyone taken into custody to be fingerprinted, and that single record had allowed the FBI to identify her body more than 3 years later. After her brief time in Florida, she had moved again, always chasing something, always moving toward a dream that kept shifting just beyond her reach. She had spent time in Santa Barbara, California, where she worked various waitressing and cashier jobs to support herself. She had also spent a period in San Diego, where she had briefly lived with a woman named Elvira French and her daughter Dorothy French, who would later become crucial witnesses in the murder investigation. The French family remembered Elizabeth clearly. They described her as a sweet, gentle young woman who was unfailingly polite and genuinely warm with people. She helped around the house. She was good company, but she was also directionless in a way that concerned them. She had no solid plan for her future, no steady work, and a tendency to trust people, particularly men, far too quickly and far too completely. It was through the French family that investigators began to piece together the timeline of Elizabeth's movements in the weeks immediately before her death. Dorothy French confirmed that Elizabeth had been staying with her family in San Diego in late December 1946. She had arrived on December 8, 1946, after being introduced to the family through a mutual acquaintance at a movie theater in San Diego. Elizabeth had been standing outside the theater looking lost and somewhat distressed, and Dorothy French had approached her and asked if she was all right. Within a short conversation, Dorothy had invited Elizabeth to come and stay with her family temporarily while she got back on her feet. Elizabeth had accepted gratefully. She moved into the French family home and spent the next several weeks there, during which time she was pleasant, helpful, and seemingly content, at least on the surface. But something was weighing on her during those weeks in San Diego. Investigators discovered that Elizabeth had been corresponding with a man during this period, a man she described to Dorothy French as someone very important to her. His name was Robert Manley. He was 25 years old, a married salesman from the Los Angeles area, and he had met Elizabeth sometime earlier in 1946 at a bus stop in San Diego. The two had struck up a conversation that had evolved into a correspondence and eventually into what appeared to be a romantic relationship, at least from Elizabeth's perspective. Dorothy French later told investigators that Elizabeth spoke about Manley frequently during her stay at the French home. She was clearly emotionally attached to him. She was waiting for him to come and take her somewhere, though exactly where, she never made entirely clear. On January 8, 1947, exactly 1 week before her body would be found, Robert Manley arrived at the French family home in San Diego to pick up Elizabeth Short. He had driven down from Los Angeles specifically to collect her. Dorothy French watched Elizabeth gather her belongings, say her goodbyes, and leave with Manley. That was the last time Dorothy French ever saw Elizabeth Short alive. What happened in the hours and days that followed became the central mystery at the heart of the entire investigation, and the question that detectives would spend years trying to answer with complete certainty. Robert Manley became the immediate prime suspect the moment investigators identified him as the last known person to have seen Elizabeth Short alive. He was located and brought in for questioning within days of the murder becoming public. What followed was one of the most intense interrogation sessions in the history of the LAPD at that time. Detectives questioned Manley exhaustively over multiple sessions. They examined his physical condition, his emotional responses, his timeline, and every detail of his account of those final hours with Elizabeth. Manley was visibly distressed throughout the interrogations. He was shaking, he was emotional, and his account, while difficult to verify completely, remained largely consistent across multiple sessions of questioning. Manley told investigators that he had picked Elizabeth up from the French family home on the evening of January 8, 1947. They had driven north toward Los Angeles together, stopping overnight at a motel in the town of Pacific Beach. Manley was insistent, and investigators ultimately found no evidence to contradict him on this point, that the overnight stay was entirely platonic. They had slept in separate beds. Nothing inappropriate had occurred. The following morning, January 9th, they had continued driving north toward Los Angeles. During the drive, Elizabeth had told Manley that she was expecting to meet her sister in Los Angeles. She seemed in reasonable spirits. She was talking about her plans, about people she was going to see, about getting settled in the city. They arrived in Los Angeles on the afternoon of January 9th, 1947. Manley drove Elizabeth to the Biltmore Hotel, one of the most famous and grand hotels in downtown Los Angeles, located on South Grand Avenue. He dropped her off in the lobby at approximately 6:30 in the evening. He watched her walk into the hotel. He got back in his car and drove away. And that was the last confirmed contact Robert Manley ever had with Elizabeth Short. He passed 2 lie detector tests. His alibi for the subsequent days was investigated thoroughly. Investigators ultimately cleared him as a suspect, though the case against him was never entirely closed in the public imagination. What happened to Elizabeth Short after she walked into the lobby of the Biltmore Hotel on the evening of January 9th, 1947, became one of the most obsessively investigated questions in American true crime history. The hotel lobby had been busy that evening. Multiple witnesses later came forward to report seeing a young dark-haired woman matching Elizabeth's description in the lobby and the surrounding area that night. A hotel employee remembered seeing her using the telephone in the lobby repeatedly over the course of several hours. She appeared to be waiting for someone. She made multiple calls. Nobody who was watching her that evening had any reason to be alarmed. She was simply a young woman waiting in a hotel lobby, making phone calls, seemingly expecting someone to arrive or to call her back. At some point between 6:30 and 10 o'clock on the evening of January 9th, Elizabeth Short left the Biltmore Hotel. Nobody saw her leave. Nobody saw which direction she went. Nobody saw who she left with, if indeed she left with anyone at all. She simply walked out of the lobby and disappeared into the night of Los Angeles. She would not be seen alive again. Between January 9th, when she vanished from the Biltmore, and January 15th, when her body was found on South Norton Avenue, 6 full days passed. 6 days during which Elizabeth Short was somewhere in Los Angeles with someone in some location before her life was ended in the most brutal way imaginable. Those 6 days represented the darkest and most impenetrable gap in the entire investigation. Investigators chased hundreds of leads trying to account for her movements during that period. Several witnesses came forward claiming to have seen her at various locations around Los Angeles in the days following her disappearance from the Biltmore. A waitress at a restaurant on South Figueroa Street claimed to have served a woman matching Elizabeth's description on January 11th. A taxi driver said he had picked up a young woman fitting her description near downtown on January 12th. A bartender recalled a dark-haired woman who had come in alone and sat quietly for over an hour before leaving. But none of these sightings could be confirmed with absolute certainty. None of them led investigators to a specific location. None of them produced a witness who had seen Elizabeth in the company of anyone specific or suspicious. What the medical examiner's report made chillingly clear was that Elizabeth Short had not died quickly. The evidence of torture on her body indicated she had been held captive and subjected to prolonged violence over a period of time before her death. She had not been killed immediately upon being taken. Someone had held her somewhere, in a house, a building, a room, for an extended period. Someone had spent time with her in the most terrifying circumstances imaginable, and then they had killed her. They had drained her body completely of blood. They had bisected her with surgical precision. They had cleaned her body thoroughly. And then in the early hours of the morning on January 15th, 1947, they had driven to that empty lot on South Norton Avenue and placed her there, posed, deliberate, and utterly without remorse for the world to find. The investigation into the murder of Elizabeth Short produced one of the most extraordinary and overwhelming lists of suspects in the history of American law enforcement. Within weeks of her body being discovered on that empty lot in Leimert Park, the Los Angeles Police Department had received over 150 confessions from individuals claiming to be responsible for her death. 150 people walked into police stations, called detectives, or sent letters claiming they had killed Elizabeth Short. Every single one of those confessions had to be investigated, verified, and either confirmed or ruled out. Every single one turned out to be false. Men and women driven by guilt, mental illness, a desire for attention, or reasons that investigators could never fully understand, came forward and confessed to a murder they had not committed. It was a phenomenon that had never been seen before on this scale in an American murder investigation, and it spoke to something deeply unsettling about the way this case had captured and disturbed the public imagination. But buried inside that avalanche of false confessions and dead-end leads were a small number of genuine suspects, men whose connections to Elizabeth Short, whose backgrounds, whose behaviors, and whose whereabouts during those crucial 6 days between January 9th and January 15th placed them under serious and sustained scrutiny from investigators. These were not random names pulled from the public response. These were individuals who had real, documented connections to the case, and their stories were in many ways as disturbing and as complicated as the murder itself. The first and most extensively investigated suspect in the Black Dahlia case was a man named Dr. George Hodel. He was a physician practicing in Los Angeles at the time of the murder. He was brilliant, educated, and deeply disturbing in ways that would only become fully apparent decades after the original investigation. Dr. Hodel had previously been investigated in connection with the death of one of his secretaries, a woman named Ruth Spaulding, who had died of a drug overdose in 1945 under circumstances that were never satisfactorily explained. He had also faced charges related to the sexual abuse of his own daughter, though he was ultimately acquitted in a trial that many observers found deeply troubling in its outcome. What made Dr. George Hodel a particularly compelling suspect in the Black Dahlia murder was not just his background, but the specific nature of the crime itself. The precision with which Elizabeth Short's body had been bisected at the waist, the clean, controlled nature of the cut, had led investigators from the very beginning to believe that whoever committed this murder had some form of medical training or surgical knowledge. Dr. George Hodel, as a practicing physician, fit that profile precisely and disturbingly well. The case against Hodel gained its most extraordinary dimension decades later when his own son, Steve Hodel, a former Los Angeles Police Department homicide detective, published a book in 2003 arguing methodically that his father was responsible for the Black Dahlia murder. Steve Hodel had spent years investigating the case after his father's death in 1999, going through personal papers, photographs, and correspondence. Among his father's personal photographs were 2 images that Steve Hodel believed were photographs of Elizabeth Short taken before her death. He also discovered that the LAPD had placed a listening device in his father's home in 1950, 3 years after the murder, and had recorded conversations in which George Hodel appeared to make statements that could be interpreted as admissions of guilt. The transcripts of those recordings contained lines that were chilling in their implication. In one recorded conversation, George Hodel was captured, saying words to the effect that he had committed certain crimes and that nobody would ever be able to prove it because he was too clever. He left the United States in the early 1950s, as if he knew investigators were closing in, and spent the remainder of his life living abroad. He died in 1999 at the age of 91, never charged, never convicted, never officially named as a suspect by the LAPD during the original investigation. The second major suspect was a man named Walter Bailey, also a physician, who lived on South Norton Avenue, the same street where Elizabeth Short's body was found. His house was less than 1 block from the exact location where the body was deposited. At the time of the murder, his marriage was collapsing and he had recently separated from his wife. His estranged wife's family had a direct connection to Elizabeth Short's family back in Massachusetts. Whether Elizabeth Short knew Walter Bailey personally was never conclusively established. But the combination, a doctor, living less than 1 block from where a surgically precise murder victim was deposited, with a family connection to the victim, placed him firmly among the most serious suspects. Bailey died in January 1948, exactly 1 year after the murder, from a neurological condition. He was never formally interviewed as a primary suspect, an omission that later analysts of the case found deeply troubling. One of the most bizarre and disturbing chapters in the entire investigation came when the killer, or someone claiming to be the killer, made direct contact. On January 24, 1947, 9 days after Elizabeth's body was discovered, the editor of the Los Angeles Examiner received a phone call. The caller identified himself as the person responsible for her murder and told the editor he was going to send some of Elizabeth's belongings to the newspaper. Several days later, a package arrived. The items inside had been soaked in gasoline before being mailed, a deliberate attempt to destroy any fingerprints or forensic evidence. Inside were several items that could only have come from someone with direct access to Elizabeth Short's personal belongings: her birth certificate, her social security card, a collection of photographs, and a personal address book with a name embossed on the cover that had been deliberately cut away, as if the killer wanted to taunt investigators with the suggestion that the answer was right there, but he was not going to make it easy. Every single person listed inside that address book was tracked down and interviewed. Every single one was cleared. The package yielded no usable fingerprints and no definitive clues. It was an act of pure psychological warfare, calculated, controlled, and deeply revealing of the kind of mind investigators were dealing with. A third significant suspect was Mark Hansen, a nightclub owner who had known Elizabeth Short personally and in whose home she had lived for a period in 1946. Multiple witnesses confirmed that Hansen had been romantically interested in Elizabeth while she had not returned those feelings, and that his pursuit of her had at times made her uncomfortable and frightened. Hansen was interviewed multiple times by investigators. He could not provide a fully satisfactory alibi for the entire period between January 9th and January 15th, but investigators were never able to gather sufficient evidence to charge him with anything, and the case against him remained circumstantial and unproven. What united virtually every serious suspect in the Black Dahlia case was a combination of factors pointing toward a specific kind of perpetrator: someone who had known Elizabeth Short personally, someone with medical knowledge or surgical skill, someone organized, controlled, and psychologically sophisticated enough to commit an extraordinarily complex crime without leaving traceable evidence, and someone who was in the assessment of every investigator who worked this case seriously, still walking free in the city of Los Angeles long after Elizabeth Short's body was found on that empty lot, living an ordinary life while her murder remained officially unsolved. Nearly 80 years have passed since Betty Bersinger walked down South Norton Avenue and stumbled upon something that would shake the entire city of Los Angeles to its core. Nearly 80 years since the LAPD launched the biggest murder investigation in its history. Nearly 80 years since Elizabeth Short's name was printed across every newspaper in America. And in all of those 80 years, not a single person has ever been charged. Not one arrest. Not one conviction. The case file sits in the LAPD archives to this day, officially open, officially unsolved, a wound that never healed, and a failure of justice that has never been explained away satisfactorily by anyone. What happened in the decades that followed the murder is a story of institutional failure, buried evidence, and a system that was simply not equipped, technically, procedurally, or morally, to deliver justice for a young woman like Elizabeth Short. The crime scene on South Norton Avenue had been compromised within hours of discovery. Members of the public had walked through the area before it was secured. Reporters had been allowed dangerously close. Evidence in the immediate vicinity had been disturbed and contaminated before investigators could properly document it. In 1947, forensic science was nowhere near the discipline it is today. No DNA analysis existed. No advanced trace evidence techniques were available. Investigators were working with fingerprints, physical evidence, and witness testimony, and all three had been weakened before the investigation properly began. The newspapers made everything catastrophically worse. Every major publication in Los Angeles was racing to break the next development. Reporters were conducting their own parallel investigations, interviewing witnesses before detectives could reach them, publishing details that should have remained confidential, and contaminating the public record in ways that made it nearly impossible to separate genuine information from noise. The publication of specific crime scene details meant that every subsequent tip, every confession, every piece of public information was filtered through what people had already read. The line between genuine knowledge and newspaper-derived knowledge became impossible to draw with any certainty, and that ambiguity poisoned the investigation at every turn. As the months became years and the years became decades, the case moved through several waves of renewed investigation and public interest. In the 1950s, journalist Will Fowler, who had been among the first reporters on the scene in January 1947, continued privately, investigating and maintained until his death that he had identified the killer but could never gather sufficient proof to publish a name. In the 1960s and 1970s, as true crime emerged as a distinct genre of American journalism, the Black Dahlia became the subject of multiple books and investigations, each proposing new suspects and new interpretations of existing evidence. Each wave ultimately crashed against the same wall. Without new physical evidence, without a verifiable confession, without a living witness prepared to tell the complete truth, no amount of research and analysis could break the case open. The most significant development in the post-investigation history of this case came in 2003 when Steve Hodel, a retired LAPD homicide detective and the son of prime suspect Dr. George Hodel, published a book laying out the case against his own father in devastating detail. Steve Hodel had spent years assembling evidence before going public. Among his father's personal belongings after his death in 1999, Steve found photographs he believed depicted Elizabeth Short taken before her death. He uncovered LAPD recordings from 1950 in which his father appeared to make statements that could only be interpreted as admissions of guilt. He documented his father's surgical skill set, his connections to the social circles Elizabeth moved through, and his sudden departure from the United States shortly after those recordings were made, as if he knew investigators were closing in and chose to run rather than face what was coming. Steve Hodel also made a connection nobody had made publicly before. He drew direct comparisons between the positioning of Elizabeth's body at the crime scene and the work of surrealist artist Man Ray, who had been a close personal friend of George Hodel in 1940s Los Angeles. The deliberate theatrical arrangement of the body, the specific nature of the wounds, the calculated staging of the entire scene. Hodel argued these were not random choices made in a moment of violence. They were artistic choices, the choices of someone who saw himself as more than a killer. Someone who saw what he did to Elizabeth Short as a performance, a statement, an act of cold intellectual darkness that the investigators of 1947 had simply not been equipped to recognize or understand for what it truly was. The LAPD acknowledged that George Hodel had been a person of interest during the original investigation and confirmed the 1950 recordings existed within the official case file. But they declined to name him officially as the prime suspect and made no definitive statement about the strength of the evidence against him. The case remained open. The position remained unchanged. For the thousands of people who had followed this story across decades, that institutional non-answer felt less like careful legal judgment and more like an organization protecting itself from the full weight of what its own failures had allowed to happen. George Hodel died in San Francisco in 1999 at the age of 91. He was never charged. He was never arrested. He never sat in a courtroom and answered for anything connected to Elizabeth Short, whether he was the man responsible. And the evidence Steve Hodel assembled is among the most compelling ever produced in connection with this case. He died free. He died in a bed. He died having spent over 50 years living his life, while Elizabeth Short lay in a cemetery in Oakland, having lived only 22 years of hers. Elizabeth Short was buried at Mountain View Cemetery in Oakland, California, on January 25, 1947. 10 days after her body was found, her mother was there. A small number of people who had known her attended. The funeral was quiet and deeply sad. She was 22 years old. She had come to Los Angeles with a dream of becoming an actress. She had come chasing the lights and the glamour and the life that Hollywood promised to beautiful young women who were brave enough to chase it. And she had been taken from the world before any of that had any chance of becoming real. Her grave is still visited today by strangers born decades after her death, who know her only through the story. People who leave flowers, who leave notes, who stand in silence for a moment and think about what was taken from her and why nobody was ever made to answer for it. The Black Dahlia case has never been solved. Elizabeth Short has never received justice. The file is still open. The killer, whoever he was, wherever he lived, however long he continued to walk through the world after January 15, 1947, was never made to face what he had done. And that truth, sitting at the center of this case after nearly 80 years, is perhaps the most disturbing truth of all. If this series hit you the way I think it did, I need you to do one thing right now. Subscribe to Hunted and Trace, not because of the algorithm, not because I am asking you to, but because this channel exists so that stories like Elizabeth's are never forgotten. Every week we go deep into the cases that the world moved on from too quickly. We do not move on. We trace every lead. We follow every clue. We give every victim a voice. Share this series with someone right now. Drop a comment telling me who you think did this. and tell me the next case you want us to cover, because your voice builds this channel. This is Hunted and Trace. No crime goes unexplored. No killer goes untraced. Elizabeth Short, we have not forgotten you.